And now I'll hand over to Mark for the talk. Away you go, Mark.
Well, good evening, everybody. It's great to have such a big audience tonight, and a real pleasure to be talking to you from down here in East Anglia. I think most of you are probably from up Yorkshire end of the country, but we've got a few Norfolk folk, I think. I had a quick glance at the list. So you're all very welcome indeed, and thank you very much for joining this talk on swallowtails, keeping them safe at home and abroad. Just very quickly tell you about the structure of my talk. I'm going to give just a few slides about the swallowtails, the family Papilionidae, at a global scale, a bit about their taxonomy, some basics, and then I'm going to talk about the projects of the Swallowtail and Birdwing Butterfly Trust that we're organising around the world, and then after about halfway through, we'll switch to a more detailed discussion of the British Swallowtail here in Norfolk, and talk about some of the work that quite a number of players down here in Norfolk are involved in one way or another. So first slide, please, Martin. So a bit about the swallowtail family, first of all, the Papilionidae, and how they fit in. On the planet, we've got about 180,000 species of butterflies and moths, which is about 3 times the number of all the species in the United Kingdom. Quite a large number. Only about 8,500 of these are butterflies and skippers. The rest are moths, of course, which are much more numerous. And the Papilionidae, the swallowtail family, has got about 580 species, about 7% of butterflies. Some recent authors make it a bigger number, but then you know what taxonomists are like, they're always splitting things up and finding new variations that become species more or less overnight. So in the 3 main families, the smallest is the Parnassiani, only 1 species, Baronia brevicornis, an unusual swallowtail, feeds on acacia in Mexico. The next subfamily, is the Parnassiani. Many of you will recognize the Apollo, Parnassus apollo, about 60 or so species, mostly temperate in distribution. And then we've got the biggest subfamily, the Papillionini, with the true swallowtails, the swordtails like the Graphiums. There's one here, Graphium macleanum from Australia, and of course the birdwings, the Ornithoptera and Triodes, of which there are 13 species, bottom right. Next slide, please. So a little bit about the biology, first of all. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with this, but the swallowtails typically have this osmeterium on the head of the caterpillar, which is a defensive scent gland. And there you can see the caterpillar responding to a threat of some kind and extruding these glands from the front of its head. Amazing thing to be able to do. Imagine if we could do that and pop things out of our forehead if we were cross with somebody. That'd be, how weird would that be? But even more amazing, I think, and we do get used to seeing these things, but it is incredible when we remind ourselves what pupae can do. On the top right, you see the pupa there hanging off the side of a stem of reed. It's got its tail end stuck down with a silk base pad, the cremaster, and a silk girdle encircling it. And this is typical of the swallowtails, except Parnassus. And then a little bit detailed down at the bottom there, you see the wing venation. That little tiny vein 2A is typical of the swallowtails. Next slide, please. So a quick word about the distribution of swallowtails around the world. Here you see the globe, and to the right of the globe are the number of species occurring at different latitudes. And you can see clearly here how much more numerous the swallowtails are in the tropical parts of the world, between 0 and 10 degrees north, 239 species, 0 to 10 degrees south, 260. But in fact, swallowtails are worldwide. They occur in Alaska, right down to Chile, and from Siberia right down to Tasmania. They are most numerous in species terms in Indonesia, Philippines, and China. Those 3 countries alone host 33% of the whole family. And if you add in Brazil, Madagascar, India, Mexico, Taiwan, Malaysia, and Papua New Guinea, you very quickly get up to 2/3 in just, what is it, 10 or a dozen countries out of the world's 200 or so. Endemism is highest in Indonesia, with the Philippines, China, Brazil, and Madagascar also very important. But from that list, you can begin to see how important Southeast Asia is for this family overall. Next slide, please. Back in the day when I was doing proper jobs, I wrote this book, Threatened Swallowtail Butterflies of the World, with a colleague, Mike Morris, who dealt with the birdwings. And we, for the first time ever, in the sort of history of red data books, they no longer get written. Of course, it's the red list these days. But in those days, we were doing more, well, shall we say, larger books than they are nowadays online. And we covered the whole family and assessed every species in the family. And this was a first, never been done for many groups of vertebrates, never mind insects. So it was quite groundbreaking. And we went on to produce an action plan covering the roughly 10% of swallowtail species that we assessed as being under threat, about 55 to 60 species. And we came up with action plans, projects really, mini projects, well, simply drafted projects, that's to say, that could be conducted out in the field. Probably fair to say not a great deal happened in the following years, one way or another. I moved on to other things, but I was able to come back to the swallowtails on retirement. And together with some friends, we created the Swallowtail and Birdwing Butterfly Trust back in 2017. It's a great pleasure now to have Martin Partridge here, your chairman, as the secretary of the trust. And we're bashing on with all sorts of projects. The IUCN Red List, which you will all probably be familiar with, has done some reassessment of birdwings in 2020 and 2021. That's just 13 or so species, but there are a huge number of species that remain really to be reassessed. Next slide, please. Just a quick word about the main threats to these butterflies. Here you see a map showing 10 or so species, many of them threatened by habitat loss, and especially on islands. Perhaps not surprising, if you look at the little box on the bottom left, 40% of all endangered species are in fact on islands, not just butterflies, but all species on islands. 80% of the world's extinct species are from islands, and this is quite surprising when islands only make up 5% of the world's land area. But across the map on the right, you can see threatened species in Jamaica, in the Comoro Islands, Sri Lanka, Philippines, places like that, Papua New Guinea, and so on. And I'll go into some of these in more detail. Other threats that occur apart from habitat loss, which is the principal one, are climate change due to pollution, commercial exploitation, and exotic introductions. I'll give you examples of all of those. Next slide, please. So we'll start with what is in fact the world's biggest butterfly, and surely the most amazing. Look at the bottom right, that is a female Queen Alexandra's birdwing on a man's chest. It has a wingspan of up to 30 centimeters, a full 1 foot. And I've never had the pleasure of seeing one. I wish I had, but people say it's like a dinner plate flying over. You know, it's quite an incredible sight to see. Top right is the male, much more colorful, but a little bit smaller. And the book on the left, Queen Alexandra's Birdwing, is one that the Swallowtail and Birdwing Butterfly Trust, we put together to assess the many, many projects actually that have been tried to try and get this butterfly more numerous in its haunts in Papua New Guinea. It's been a struggle. There are two populations in the Popondetta lowlands, which have principally been deforested for oil palm, but fortunately also on the Managalas Plateau, which is a higher area that is much more difficult of access and may possibly, well, we all hope, has a much more sustainable population. One of the big threats, you won't be too surprised, has been commercial collecting in the past, as well as oil palm plantations. Bottom left is an advertisement for a male Queen Alexandra's birdwing, almost $13,000, claiming to be a variant with a pink tinge almost certainly something that was created using the exposure to ultraviolet light. This is an excessive price, even by Queen Alexandra's birdwing standards, but the specimens do command prices above $5,000, even though nowadays it is forbidden in international trade, being listed on CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, on Appendix 1. So it's that no export from Papua New Guinea is permitted in law. Next slide, please. So we'll look at what's going on with our project and our partners working out in Papua New Guinea. This is in Popondetta, where working with an oil palm plantation company that is moving towards sustainability and committed to sustainability, they've set up a project with laboratories, special outdoor nurseries for propagating the Aristolochia vines that are needed for breeding the butterfly, and they are attempting to breed the butterflies in captivity in special cages in the hope that they could be reintroduced to places like the little bit of riverine forest you can see bottom left in amongst all the oil palm plantations. As yet, after quite some few years actually, it hasn't yet proved possible to breed the butterfly in captivity. It is a very large species, and smaller birdwings have been bred, but they need big cages and special conditions, as you can imagine. So it is quite challenging, and we're still working to do what we can to take this forward. But arguably more needs to be done with the people up on the Managalas Plateau as well. Next slide, please. We're going to, next slide, Martin. Yeah, we're popping off now to Sabah, North Borneo. Some of you may have been there, where we find Troides andromache, another birdwing, top right. This is a birdwing from mid-montane forests. Beautiful, beautiful thing, but its habitat much reduced these days through deforestation in Borneo. And it's now, we believe, confined to Mount Kinabalu, the highest mountain in Southeast Asia, where it lives in the middle latitudes of the mountains. And the project here, interesting, Kinabalu is a World Heritage Site and a very famous one. But if you went there a few years ago, you wouldn't have been told about this butterfly, even though it's you know, an endemic now and extremely rare and very, very beautiful. Surprising that the National Parks authorities and local people weren't really, you know, saying much about it. But we supported a project there with a chap called Stephen Sutton in Kota Kinabalu. He worked with local people, such as the people on top left, in villages, who helped to find out where the butterfly was, what it was feeding on, what its habits were, and also to interpret how important this butterfly is to local people, including to schools. And at the bottom of the screen, you can see a local school that choreographed a Kinabalu birdwing butterfly dance. And this is all helping to interpret information about these marvelous species to local people so that they can help support them. We're now about to send out a Dutch PhD student, Corné van der Linden. In fact, we've just heard from him in the last few days that he's able to go now. Restrictions have been lifted. He will soon be going out there to continue the research and to assist these local villages who are starting to breed the butterflies and to share lots of information with tourists and make the whole thing more sustainable. Next slide, please. So we're going to go off now to Jamaica in the Caribbean, and this lovely species is the homerus swallowtail, Papilio homerus, the largest butterfly in the Americas as a whole. A fantastic animal. It survives in the karst forests. These are limestone forests, very rugged areas in Jamaica. Has been sought after by collectors for many years. It is itself on CITES Appendix 1 now, so it's not allowed to be collected, but a lot of its habitat has been destroyed, and it's now confined to two separated populations, which is a little bit of a problem in the east and the west of the country, a problem because we don't really know quite whether these populations are genetically different, and to undertake any breeding or other activities to join them up or whatever we might try to do, we need to know whether they are the same species or different. So one of the things we're doing straight off is with Professor Eric Garraway, top right. Him and his students at the University of West Indies are under license collecting just little nicking off the tails of some specimens that they capture for DNA analysis. It hasn't yet been successful. We've got enough specimens from the eastern population, but not the west. And we're hoping next year to send out Fabienne Condamine, who's a French expert who can undertake some of these activities in the field, and he would not need many specimens. So we're continuing with that work. Next slide, please. Now, here we're going back east to Australia. Australia has 3 species of birdwing. This is the Richmond birdwing, which lives on the east coast and has become fragmented in its habitat because of deforestation and agriculture. Many of the smaller patches of forest in which it lives, the species has become extinct because the patches are too small, too much inbreeding, that sort of thing. Plus, unfortunately, the horticulture people there imported a species of Dutchman's pipevine. The Aristolochia is the genus that most birdwings feed on. They imported one for gardens, and it escaped and started to spread. Seems obviously a big problem in Australia. And this butterfly, the females couldn't distinguish the difference between the imported invasive species and the species that they required, which is Aristolochia privinosa. And when the caterpillars hatched on the wrong species, they were killed by the poisons in that plant. Big problem. So the Queensland Wildlife Preservation Society of Queensland has been taking out the species from the forest that they don't want. We've helped them to buy and to propagate the right ones, which get planted out, and they also get grown, as you can see bottom right, on these ropes as sort of decoys to encourage egg laying. And this project is really, I think, one of the finest butterfly projects in the world. It involves a lot of community work, local people, school children and others, and it's proving very, very successful. We're very proud to have been a part of it. Next slide, please. So now we're going to Fiji, where back in 2017, Operation Wallacea, which is an organization that takes students out on gap years to nice places on expeditions and what have you. And they went to the Ngatiwa Peninsula, which is that bit that's sticking out of the bottom of Vanuatu. Yeah, that's it. Thank you, Martin. That's the Ngatiwa Peninsula with a very narrow isthmus. And it's a place where a number of important endemics are found, like the Ngatiwa silktail is another one. And while they were there, they had a bird surveyor, an Australian, who photographed a butterfly. That is the actual photograph in the center at the bottom that he took, and they couldn't identify it. And they wrote to us with a picture and said, can you help us? What is it? And it turned out that it was an unidentified species. It was not known to science. We were somewhat dubious about it. Everybody was, actually. We wondered if it had escaped from somewhere. If so, what was it? Or had it been put together, this picture, by some genius? Turned out no, and it was a brand new species, only known from that peninsula. And in 2018, a full survey was done. We sent out some of our associates there to work with the local people, and further research into food plants and so on was done. We've now had genetic analysis results come through, and the nearest relative is Papilioninae on the bottom right, the dingy swallowtail from eastern Australia, which looks completely different. But the reason it looks different is that it's a mimic. It mimics another butterfly called Cressida cressida, which explains why these two butterflies don't look very similar at all, but genetically they are. Next slide, please. So this project is continuing. it's very confined in its distribution, the butterfly. So Richard Markham on the left is our associate out there. He's a local cocoa farmer and also an entomologist. He's really spearheading a project to get local people involved in ecotourism about the butterfly, and a captive breeding facility as well, which you can see in the central two photographs. This is going extremely well. We've had Clive Huggins, top right, going out working with local people to identify the food plant, which unusually turned out to be a species of ebony tree, very unusual. Never heard such a thing in the family before. So this is an amazing butterfly. Unfortunately already threatened. It has been illegally collected. We're in touch with the Fijian authorities to try and get it listed on CITES, but that's a slow process. And we think the best way forward is to get local people involved in the way that we're doing, and they they see a value in the species, and of course they then are more likely to protect it and prevent illegal collecting and that sort of thing. Very exciting project. Next slide, please. So there's lots more to do before we leave the sort of world scope of our work. Things like Papilio chikai, top left, in montane forest of the Philippines, again, highly collectible, very, very rare indeed. Paraides birchellanus, bottom left, recently listed on CITES, is a very rare butterfly found in only small patches of forest of riverine forest in Brazil, not in the main rainforest, in much smaller patches. Two middle species from the Comoro Islands, about which we know very little. Sri Lanka, we'd love to go and work there. They have an action plan, and they've identified Pacleopter jophon, the Ceylon rose, as an important species. We haven't yet managed to do that, but we're still hopeful. Next slide, please. So in summary of our overseas projects, the swallowtails and birdwings, I think you can probably see from what I've shown you this evening already that they are iconic flagships, really, for insect conservation worldwide. They're very spectacular. They're capable of bringing in a lot of community engagement, and they're very useful for publicity and so on for conservation projects. So the 50 or so species that we need to conserve, they're excellent targets for conservation organizations locally, and we try to work with them as much as we can. We still need to do more work on food plant ecology and taxonomy, perhaps food plants in particular, which tend to be less well known in tropical parts of the world than they are here in the United Kingdom. And as you've seen, habitat loss, unsurprisingly, is the main challenge, but we've got a lot of problems with commercialization, invasive species like in Australia, and climate change. I'm not sure I mentioned that, but the Kinabalu swallowtail in these mid-montane latitudes is suffering from a reduction in its range as climate change takes a hold and moves the various forest zones up the mountainsides. There's a concern that the habitat of these montane species becomes ever smaller. So next slide, please, and we'll move on to a consideration in more detail of the British swallowtail. There is one there, nectaring, here in East Anglia, and on the left you see its food plant, milk parsley, which is an umbellifer. Here you see its umbels emerging from the reed beds in which milk parsley only grows. Next slide, please. So the life cycle and taxonomy. Just a quick look at the life cycle. Here you can see the egg and the younger instars in the photo bottom left. Bottom right is the final instar on one of the umbels of milk parsley, and of course the adult top right. Now, this is by no means an endangered species around the world. It's actually very common. Papilionidae is very common. It has a holarctic distribution, which means that it occurs right around the planet, with one subspecies sort of merging into another. There are 24 subspecies altogether going right around the northern hemisphere, and our own subspecies, Papilionidae britannicus, is just one of those. But of course, it's very important to us, obviously. But there's another subspecies in Britain nowadays, which has come over because of the warming of our seasons, and that's Papilionidae gorganus, which is a European swallowtail and a vagrant. It's always been a vagrant visitor to the United Kingdom. Well, that wasn't always recognised 2 or 3 centuries ago, but it's probably always getting blown over here, but not breeding. But now it has started to breed in various places on the south coast, very occasionally, not very frequently. But what's important about Gorganus is that it's a much less fussy feeder than Papiliomacaron britannicus. Britannicus probably found its distribution minimized during the Ice Age, and it found a niche that it could survive in East Anglia by feeding and choosing to feed on milk parsley, which has proved to be a success ever since. But Gorganus feeds on, which would not have been so badly affected by the Ice Ages, will feed on carrots and all sorts of fennel and all sorts of roadside umbellifers. It's much less fussy. So it is undoubtedly spreading across England, southern England. We don't yet know of a location where it coexists with Britannicus, and we don't yet know whether it would hybridize naturally in the wild, but it may well do. So that could be a bit of a problem. Next slide, please. So I'm sorry, the quality of this is rather poor. It's taken from Butterfly Conservation's website just a few days ago. What I realize you can't see the dots for 1917 to 1982, but you can see some of the open circles for 1995 to 2009. And you can see that the overall range of Papiliomacaron, the both subspecies this is, has been reducing significantly from this map since the late or mid 1990s at least. Now this map doesn't show which ones are Gorganus, which ones are Britannicus, but it does still show that East Anglia has been for a long time and still is the stronghold of the swallowtails. And of course our swallowtail depends on reed beds and milk parsley that grows in reed beds. And for centuries now, those reed beds and those wetlands have been drained and the distribution of Britannicus has reduced. Next slide, please. Now this picture shows where Gorganus has been found and where Britannicus has been found. And you can now see more clearly that Gorganus will fly all over the place, and has got, up into North Wales and places like that, as well as all on the south coast, Kent, across to the Scilly Isles as well. Whereas Britannicus has for a long time been confined to Suffolk and Norfolk. And today its distribution is even narrower than is shown on this picture. Next slide, please. So here is a map, unfamiliar, I'm sure, to most of you watching tonight, but I'll do my best to explain. This is Norfolk, part of Norfolk. It's the Norfolk coast. Down at the bottom right is Breydon Water and Great Yarmouth, and coming out from there are the rivers. I'm sorry they don't show better, but I can just quickly tell you that the River Yare, which is one of Norfolk's biggest rivers, has got these are the breeding sites of Papiliomacaron britannicus. And as far as we know, these are the only ones remaining today. There may be more, we don't know, but these are the ones that we know about today. So the bottom three are some quite well-known places like Strumpshaw, Wheat Fen, a smaller place called Church Marsh, along the River Bure, which is 4, 5, 6, 7 basically. You've got Upton, Broad, Ranworth, Cockshoot, Woodbastwick. The point is the swallowtail doesn't breed along the river in the lower reaches because a lot of that you can just see faintly the river above the road there. A lot of that is salty, if not salt marsh, and the river there is fairly saline. So it's up in the headwaters that you find the clear and fresh water that the milk parsley requires. Milk parsley will not put up with anything other than perfectly clean water. And then at the top sort of left-hand side, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, this is the River Ant with Barton Broad and some well-known places up there like Hickling Broad, Martham Broad, where some of you may have been on your holidays at various times. And on the top right, these are the headwaters of the River Thurn, which during Roman times used to go out into the sea, in fact. Hickling Broad, Horsey Mere, Martham Broad. In fact, they are, even though the river doesn't go to the sea, it sort of peters out and these butterflies are surviving up there. There is some salinization there because the seawater comes, seeps under the seawall, gets into the dikes up in that part of Norfolk and is pumped from the dikes, unfortunately, into Horsey Mere and then down into towards Hickling, which is at the top end of the Broad. So there's a little bit of a problem with that. But the point really to take away from this is we've got really very few breeding sites remaining, and all of these actually are in reserves and sites of special scientific interest and all the rest of it. All the surrounding countryside beyond these reserves and so on is unsuitable now for milk parsley and the swallowtail. Next slide, please. Now, just a few words about the conservation status. First of all, the UK butterfly, I apologise the data a bit out of date. I keep meaning to sort of update this, although I don't think we've had a more recent edition of the state of the UK's butterflies, but there are data from these Transect sites which I really ought to dig out. But the key thing to take away is the counts of swallowtails in Transect sites, which are invariably in protected areas. These have gone up because the managers like RSPB, NW, Norfolk Wildlife Trust and others, they've managed the sites well, including for swallowtails, and so the swallowtails have been quite successful there. But when you look at the wider countryside, the butterfly is currently only in 6 10-kilometre squares and 78 1-kilometre squares, and that's down 56% between 1974 and 2014, and it was down 13% between 2005 and 14. So you've got an interesting picture with increasing populations where the butterfly is well protected and well managed, but outside those reserves, the presence has rapidly declined. It was always a surprise to me that the butterfly was only given medium priority back in 1995, the action plan, but recently in a revised red list of British butterflies, Fox and Dennis have now revised the category of the swallowtail to vulnerable, which I think is more than justified. Next slide, please. So we need to also look at milk parsley. This is the obligate food plant of the swallowtail, with an exception. There's always an exception, and Kevin Radley at Wheat Fenn Reserve here in Norfolk has found the swallowtail occasionally feeding on hemlock, but this is very unusual indeed. By and large, the butterfly requires milk parsley, which is a wetland species, very fussy, and will only occur in reed beds and other very clean waters nearby. There's a very limited UK distribution. You can see from the map here the fully black closed dots post 1950 are far fewer than pre-1950, although you can see, and they're confined basically nowadays to Norfolk. This map is quite old, Meredith and Grubb, 1993. They're almost entirely now in Norfolk, not in Suffolk or Cambridgeshire. And there are, however, a few plants, some plants down in Somerset. You can see the dots there. That's in the Avalon Marshes at Shapwick, where there is milk parsley, but the swallowtail is not found there. In terms of the management of milk parsley, after reed cutting, it does germinate well, but then if you cut the reed, when you cut the reeds, the plants, they're biennials, and the plants respond badly and won't grow back. I said it needs wet ground, but not flooded ground. They like to grow on little tussocks, often with sedges and things like that, with water surrounding, but not actually in, with their roots fully in the water. One good thing is milk parsley is quite easy to propagate and is indeed offered in garden centres as well, and people can put it around their ponds and what have you. As you can see, milk parsley is a problem for the swallowtail too. Next slide, please. Now, this is milk parsley. Left, you can actually see some early instar larvae on that milk parsley, you see the more finely divided leaves that distinguishes milk parsley from other umbellifers. And once you get your eye in, it's quite easy to see it, how different it is from other species. There in the middle, you can see again the slide I showed earlier of the emerging stems, and the butterflies love to fly, the females love to fly fast across a reed bed, looking for these flower heads, and then landing to lay their eggs on them. Unfortunately, we now have another problem in that last year a fungal pathogen destroyed more than 90% of the milk parsley at a very important site at Wheat Fenn, where Kevin Radley and Will Fitch have been doing excellent work for many years surveying the butterflies. This attack, which you can see in the right-hand picture, was very, very serious. The species involved were sent off to RHS, the Royal Horticultural Society in Wisley, and also Kew, and only in the last 10 days, 2 weeks, we've learnt of the specific identification from Faye Newbury at Wisley of Diaportha angelica, an alternaria of a species close to Infectoria. So at least we know what's causing it now. What we don't know is how to treat these things, which is obviously a big worry. We need to do more work on that. These fungi are found on crops as well, so we may be able to get some information usefully from those sources. But the worry is, to what extent has this pathogen or these two pathogens been found to occur in other sites amongst the 17 breeding sites where the swallowtail and the milk parsley coexist? We don't know that, and in SBBT we are planning to carry out surveys in all these breeding sites. We've been in touch with Natural England. We'll need permission to do this sort of thing, and of course we'll be working with the breeding site managers in RSPB and the other NGOs as well to see what can be done and how big the problem is. Next slide, please. I don't know why my computer turned this into a white slide, but decided it would. So, just a little bit of information about the impact of climate change now and habitat loss on both the swallowtail and the milk parsley. In 2010, the University of East Anglia audited the threat of climate change on Broadland species, which was found to be very, very significant. They identified over 1,500 priority species which were of some concern, in other words, 67 of which were already extinct, 356 of which were not seen lately. So, we're a worry. And we do know that the Broads, and of course I should say, I haven't mentioned this, but I'm sure you're aware that the Broads are entirely man-made and are maintained only through management, careful management, both of the rivers, which have to be dredged, and of the remaining reed beds and so on, which have to be cared for carefully. They're no longer commercialized, only in patches, as they would have been a few hundred years ago, when the butterfly would have been much more common. But the Broads have been losing species, 6 species a decade since the 1950s, and the problem continues. And the UEA warned that very few Broad species would have the capacity to adapt to the speed of climate warming, because unlike some other species of butterfly which have been moving north in Britain, I'm sure you've been hearing and reading about those, this species has really got nowhere to go, unfortunately, and the speed of climate warming and sea level rise are a big worry. Next slide, please. The Broadland Futures Initiative is spearheaded by the Broads Authority here in Norfolk, and it's been looking at the future impacts of climate change on Broadland. Essentially, we're in, across the country really, for warmer and wetter winters, hotter and drier summers. Not much news there, but the sea level rise in our part of the world is likely to be serious. Don't forget that those rivers that I pointed out, the Yare, the Bure, the Thurn, the Ant, these are tidal rivers. there's no locks on them. They run out to the sea uninhibited. So sea level rise will mean river level rise, and it will mean salinization as well. In the next 20 years, we're expecting river levels to rise 19 to 22 centimeters, 22 to 46 centimeters in 50 years, and 54 to 102 centimeters in 100 years. These assessments are still going on, and of course, there's a lot of conjecture in there. But one thing to say is that in this part of the world, these figures that I've just given, it's not like a mill pond that's slowly coming up. You get wind over tide events in this part of the world, which can be very, very serious. If you get a very high tide coming up into the rivers and a following wind behind it, it can blow huge amounts of water up into the river and through the tide and so on. And then if you get heavy rainfall, if you're unfortunate enough to get heavy rainfall in the upper reaches as well, then that water can't escape. You get a lot of flooding. And the flooding from Braden water up into the rivers will become increasingly saline. A lot of the natural or semi-natural areas nearer the coast will become brackish marshlands, and there'll be much more of that and less room available for the butterflies and for milk parsley, and indeed for many other species that depend on fresh water in Broadland. Next slide, please. So on this next picture, you see groups of us who got together back in 2018 at Fenn. We had a big conference to discuss, these problems, get together, see what could be done, get all our organizations working together. It was an excellent meeting. A lot of people contributed. Next slide, please. And we produced a paper. This is the title of it, The Ecology and Conservation of the British Swallowtail, with many authors, some of whom will be familiar to you. So this laid out some of the problems and created a new baseline from which we could start doing some more research and to address the conservation issues that I've been describing. Next slide, please. So on this slide, you can see some students we brought in after the conference, working with the University of East Anglia. There's Hamish Lillywhite and Susie Hills, two UEA students. Hamish on the right with me out in a boat. We went out surveying in some Broads that had not been looked at before to see if there was milk parsley there. And a third student, Sarah Sheehan, has also been brought in after Susie and Hamish to continue some of the work. So these students have done some excellent work with the University of East Anglia to take the issue forward and to get detailed information about particularly about the ecological requirements of milk parsley, without which the swallowtail can't survive. Next slide, please. Now, one thing is absolutely clear: milk parsley needs very clean water, and this is an image that shows the rivers that I talked about earlier: the Yare, Bure, Thurn, and Ant, with the breeding sites superimposed, but with an estimated 1 meter sea level rise over Broadland. As you can see, Braden water is huge. This is much more a picture of what it was like in Roman times, actually, when sea levels were higher, by a meter or so than they are today. The worry here is that, with the possible exception of that one down at the bottom right, where the others are all up in the headwaters, will the salinized water reach that far? Will these sites be flooded out? Will there be too much salt going up there for the milk parsley to survive, or will the floods come in too quickly for milk parsley to move to slightly drier spots that it requires, or what? We don't know what will happen, but we think that these 17 sites are all to some degree vulnerable to what will happen, particularly in the upper Thurn, which is on the top right, where I mentioned already salinization is a bit of a problem under the seawall. The Thurn in Roman times was actually bigger than this and actually had an estuary out to sea as well. So that's not likely to, those areas are not likely to be good for the swallowtail. The upper Ant and the upper Bure and the upper Yare, possibly. But the risk, I think, is pretty clear from this map. Next slide, please. Next slide, please, Martin. Yeah. So now we're going to look at this. These are the 17 breeding sites of the swallowtail, and the Hamish, Lily White, and Susie Hills did some analysis of some of them, not all. We've done only 9 of the 17 sites have been analysed so far. On the extreme right of this table, you can see the percentage of area of these sites. When I say area, these sites are protected areas. So Hamish and Susie looked at how much of those protected areas would be lost to sea level rise with, in this case, 1.2 meters. Obviously, as I'm sure you'd understand, the estimates of what will happen are a bit wide. We don't really know, none of us. But the worry here is that many of these sites will lose more than 90% of their area. And it's only a few of them, like Wheat Fen, Catfield, and Sutton, which I've put boxes round, that may have decent areas left. But these are very small areas, actually. Catfield and Sutton particularly, but Wheat Fen is still only 69 hectares. So it's a bit of a problem. Next slide, please. We need to do the rest of the sites. This picture, produced by Hamish, one of our MSc students, shows 3 protected areas. Now, it's only within the red boundary that the amount of sea level rise has been sort of coloured in, because obviously it goes outside the boundaries as well. But if we did that, you wouldn't be able to see the boundaries at all. So on the left is Hickling Reserve, very famous reserve, which with 0.6 of a metre sea level rise, top left is virtually completely inundated, and the bottom left it's completely inundated. The middle picture is a place called Howe Hill, another famous site for swallowtails. Doesn't do too badly in the early stages of sea level rise, but again, completely inundated if it does get up to the sort of levels we've talked about. And the picture on the right is Strumpshaw, another famous reserve, again, showing how sea level rise may well affect these places. And so quite a worrying scene from just 3 examples. Next slide, please. So a question that's arisen: could the swallowtails be translocated? Are there safer places where they could be taken to? Well, there have been attempts, as many of you will know, in Wicken Fenn in Cambridgeshire, which was a famous site for swallowtails pre-1950, but they were lost and they were reintroduced in 1974-75 with milk parsley plants as well as the swallowtails, 228 swallowtails. There you can see some good old boys with cardboard box full of adults there. But they were already extinct by 1980. They were reintroduced again 1993, but they failed again due to drought. I've talked to the people there, National Trust, run Wicken Fenn. They're naturally, a bit cautious about trying another introduction to Wicken, but maybe there's a chance. There's the Great Fenn project, which is seeking to recover large areas of Cambridgeshire from agriculture and link up wetlands across the county, including with Wicken Fenn. So in years to come, there may be a case for introducing the milk parsley. I have addressed the working committee of the Great Fenn project and suggested they begin to propagate and reintroduce milk parsley, and we'll see in years to come whether that comes to pass. Next slide, please. So translocation options, unfortunately, are rather limited. In Norfolk, we've got places like the Trinity Broads, which are not really very suitable at the moment, has to be said. The upper reaches of the rivers Ant and Bure are possible, but some of the others, like the Wissey and the Wensum valleys, are principally on chalk, and it may be that milk parsley is not very happy with chalky streams. I'm not sure research has been done on that particular point as it stands, but certainly if the pH gets too high, milk parsley is not happy. It needs more or less neutral conditions to grow successfully. Sculthorpe Moor Nature Reserve in North Norfolk. I'm in discussion with them. That's run by the Hawk and Owl Trust. There is a small area of reed bed. Again, it's in the Wensum Valley. I'm not sure if the pH would be suitable. A nice place that I quite fancy for this project is Lakenheath Fern in Cambridgeshire. It's about 90 kilometres away from where the swallowtails currently are. They can fly about 30 kilometres, but they ain't going to reach Lakenheath. And even if they did, they won't find any milk parsley. Lakenheath used to be a huge carrot farm, which is possibly a good sign because at least it's the same type of plant as milk parsley. And the milk parsley, if it was introduced there, would probably grow quite well, but it's not there at the moment. What we also don't know is how vulnerable Lakenheath is to sea level rise and salinisation. But I think it's a lot better than many of the sites in Norfolk. So that's a possibility. It's an RSPB reserve that needs further discussion. I mentioned the Great Fenn project. The good thing about the Great Fenn is that it is great. It's large. You know, we're pushing 2,000 plus hectares of land here that could be suitable for this work. As yet, it isn't, but as the years go by, this may be one of the great hopes for the butterfly and milk parsley. I mentioned Shapwick in Somerset. It would be fascinating to try and introduce the butterfly there, but the problem is there is milk parsley, but the problem is, and it's quite big, 500 hectares, but it's subject to sea level rise in the Somerset levels, and you know that might not be worth the effort if then the salt water gets in or flooding destroys these sites. Next slide, please. So in summary, I'm drawing to a close now. The British swallowtail was once very widespread, of course, across England, across our wetlands, but it became very narrowly distributed as a result of agricultural change and so on. I'm sure that story is well known to you. Until now, the British swallowtail is very, very rare, but fairly stable in the areas in which it's well managed, which are protected areas, most of them run by NGOs. The milk parsley, its food plant, is also very narrowly distributed. Its ecology not well understood, although our students that worked with UEA have done well and come up with some very interesting data. But now we find this fungal pathogen creeping in, and we're not sure what the story is there. We're looking to do research to study it and find out whether it's reaching into other sites. At the same time, climate change and sea level rise are very likely in the passage of time to destroy quite a number of the currently known breeding sites. And I can't imagine a great deal can be done about that. Some of the land in Norfolk will be given up to flooding as the sea level rises. Without major engineering works, you know, we're going to see a very different landscape inevitably. And then, of course, there's still Gorganus, a lovely species, not unwelcome, one might say, in Britain, a lovely thing to see on the south coast and further afield. It may spread, it may hybridize, and it may threaten Britannicus. We don't know at this point. We need, of course, lots of areas there I've mentioned need more research. Milk parsley and the swallowtail, swallowtails, both subspecies. We need to resolve the fungal pathogen problem, and we ought to be thinking about translocation and maybe trying something out in some of the sites that I've mentioned. So that's, you know, in brief, where we are with the British swallowtail. And it's been a pleasure to have had the opportunity. Thank you to Butterfly Conservation in Yorkshire, and particularly Martin and Nick for making this happen. And thank you all for attending. And I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
So if you've got a question for Mark, please could you use the chat button, which you will find at the bottom of your screen. Any questions?
You have to have one ready in your pocket, Martin.
Somebody must have a question, surely. I'll give somebody a couple of minutes or a couple of seconds.
Sure. Here we go.
Right, here we are.
Yeah, I can read it myself. So
Yeah,
Ben is asking, did I say that the fens are man-made, but that the swallowtail requires the fens? And if that's the case, is it possible to create an environment for them? Well, nice thought, Ben. The Broads across Norfolk were man-made, and this wasn't known until quite recently in the 1950s, when it was discovered that actually they are all peat diggings. They were all dug out for peat to burn for heating and so on. Huge quantities of peat were used by priories and abbeys and Norwich Cathedral and places like that, and by ordinary people for cooking and heating. So, and then the sea level changed and rose, and these diggings were flooded. So they are man-made. So in theory, yes, you could go further afield, but where are you going to find places where you can dig holes like that and create reed beds of this sort of scale? It's a nice thought. I think the best bet currently is what's happening in Cambridgeshire with the Great Fenn project, where water levels are being artificially raised as the drainage is being reversed, in effect, by NGOs and others taking over agricultural land and turning it back into wetland. But the milk parsley will need to be introduced there, and that would be in itself a major project. So I think, yeah, the answer is they are all man-made, and it would be a very exciting project to try to get the butterfly and the milk parsley to survive elsewhere. Now, shall I struggle on with the next one?
Yeah, if you can read the next one, Mark, go ahead.
Okay. So there's somebody in Swaffham with a home also at Thurn, local places, asking if they planted milk parsley in the garden, could it attract the odd swallowtail? The answer is yes. The swallowtail actually can be seen quite regularly across Norfolk, even Suffolk, in late May and through June. You are guaranteed to see them if you go to the protected areas, but they do famously visit gardens all over the county. They can fly up to 30 kilometers. They're strong flyers, so you've got a very good chance of seeing them. But whether they'd come in to find your milk parsley, slightly doubtful. They're more likely just to be coming into nectar in your garden on the flowers, rather than looking for the milk parsley, which they would tend to find only in reed beds. We do find milk parsley with Hamish and Susie. We found milk parsley growing on the edge of Broads at Buckenham and Hassingham, under low trees, what we call carr woodland, wet woodland. And so milk parsley will actually grow in places other than reed beds, but the butterfly won't go there. So at Buckenham and Hassingham, even though there are quite a lot of milk parsley plants, particularly at Hassingham Broad, which is just a small broad, the butterflies have never been known to breed there because they don't fly under sort of overhanging foliage and so on. They like the reed beds, the open reed beds that they fly across at great speed. So you may well get them in your garden, but they're more likely to be on your nectaring plants.
Question from Roger.
Hang on.
Do you limit visits to other sites to prevent fungal spread?
Well, Roger, a very good question. The answer is we don't know. This fungus was only found last year. We don't know anything about it. I'm a bit suspicious because in the field right next to wheat fen last year was a huge field of ordinary parsley, flat leaf parsley, the stuff we eat. And I'm wondering whether, it's a bit of a coincidence that such a close relative was right there and then this appeared. But actually the fungus has been found right back into the 1930s at wheat fen. It was recorded by a famous naturalist called Ted Ellis, famous around here anyway. And so it's known to be there. Maybe it's the warm weather that is making the fungus more successful. We don't know. Whether it's spread to the other 16 sites. This is something we want to study this year, and we're all, in SBBT, we're putting together a project now together with the Norfolk and Norwich Naturalist Society and other partners like Wheat Fenn and others, who we're hoping to get all the conservation site managers to help us in a survey to find out the extent to which this fungus has spread.
Do we know the host? Do we know the host range of this fungus, Mark?
No, I don't have that information, actually, unfortunately. Literally, it's in the last 10 days that we've heard the identification of it. It's known from agriculture, but we don't know how widespread it is. So watch this space. You know, maybe in a couple of years' time, I'll be able to come back and tell you what's going on. But let me take the next one. Are the moors of Thorn and Hatfield suitable? I think not, because well, I don't actually know the places that you're mentioning, Paul, but are they wet, or if they're the sort of heathlands like we've got around Norwich, they're not suitable. They've got to be flooded, and they're not moors. They're reed beds, Phragmites australis, you know, from across to the horizon.
They're huge, Mark. It's thousands and thousands of acres of wetland. A good percentage is flooded.
At Thorn and Hatfield?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, I don't know them. So that's interesting. And are they reed beds?
There are a lot of reed beds in among, yes.
Well, there's a lot of Phragmites.
Okay, well, you never know. Give it a shot. If they're very acid,
Yes.
then if they're very, very acid, the milk parsley probably won't survive.
Mm.
So I think that could be a problem. But you know, you can get the seeds quite easily. Give it a go. Give it a go. Be interesting to try. Is it known why relocations failed in the past? Well, Wicken, yeah, a couple of things. First of all, Wicken, as many of you might know, has been very susceptible to drying out. It had to be very artificially maintained. All the agricultural land around Wicken is sort of sunk by meters because of the drying out for as they were drained for agriculture. And Wicken, very difficult place to maintain, and not very big one. And the fact it's not very big is also a problem, because just through stochastic processes, the butterfly gets attacked. It does have its own predators, of course, and parasites. And if you don't have enough populations around to migrate back into spaces that have been vacated because they've overused or overexploited the milk parsley, or been attacked by predators or other things, for any reason, local population gone extinct, the other populations don't get in. And Wicken was just too small for these natural processes of reintroduction into vacant lots, so to speak, to happen. So that seems to be the basic story. Have I reached the end of the questions, Martin?
There you have, Mark. I have a question for you.
Okay.
There are obviously many species of both birdwing and swallowtail which have been classed as endangered or vulnerable, at least. I know they're going to put you on the spot with this one, but do you think if they relax the CITES regulations, then we would have less black market situations with people trying to sell them, but also it would give people the opportunity to breed these butterflies to help with the conservation of them? So.
Yes, it's a good question. It's a tricky one, but it is a good one. And of course, CITES has got two appendices. Well, it's got three actually, but the two important ones are the Appendix 1, which forbids international trade, and Appendix 2, which allows international trade under license. But in reality, an awful lot of countries, you know, they just don't allow Appendix 2. They can't be bothered with all the sort of licensing and monitoring and all the rest of it. So they just sort of ban trade. And then, of course, the authorities, they ban it, but they don't do anything about it. And it's terribly easy to kill butterflies, put them in envelopes as traditional method for Lepidopterus, and you can just post them, and the chance of them being found is remote, frankly. In Indonesia, it's well known that local communities actually living on the edge of national parks use them. They go into to source butterflies, and CITES really has little or no impact. I think it is a moot point. In the trust, we would like to do a study to try to see whether over the years the CITES listings have had any impact on some of the species that have been treated in this way. I suspect that it would be very difficult to find any evidence of this. I mean, butterflies generally they reproduce relatively freely, as do most insects, of course, and collecting a few is generally not likely to have a major impact, although that's not always true, of course. And we do know of cases of Parnassius and others that very limited distribution that can be badly affected. But I think a study needs to be done on CITES to see whether there has been much evidence of success as a result of those listings, and then look at the opportunities for encouraging people to captive breed, to be guides, butterfly guides, as we're doing in Fiji, for example, with the Natiwa swallowtail, this beautiful new species that's been found. You know, if people could be, there are lots of bird guides now, increasingly in the tropics, you know, all the holidays that you see, but there's plenty of room for butterfly guides as well, people to go out guiding tourists, eco-tourists and visitors to look at local butterfly species. And I think that move could be more successful than trying to ban trade, which at the end of the day is much less of a problem than habitat destruction.
Thanks, Mark. Anybody else got any questions? There's nothing else in the chat box. Anybody else want to unmute themselves and perhaps ask Mark a question? Don't see anything else. Okay, well, it just leaves me to say, Mark, thanks ever so much for giving us this this talk. It's been, as I know a bit of it in the background, it's wonderful to hear it all, and it's wonderful to be involved. But thank you so much again for your time and for putting this talk together for us. So.
Well, it's absolutely my pleasure. It's been great. Thank you all, even though I can't see you all as it stands, but I know you're out there, and thank you very much for taking an interest in this, and hope to see you again before too long. Thanks again to everybody for coming in on the talk.